a bit of the global picture, how the economy has historically performed, and then going into a bit of a deep dive as to the revenue and expenditure trends and the structural problems that we have with the economy, both on the revenue side and then on the expenditure side. And would go a bit into the debt sustainability issues and go then to a bit more sectoral level as to how things are performing overall and what we should expect going forward in Ghana. So just to quickly show you my main points because of time, there's no gainsay, or most of us know that what the pandemic has actually done, in my view, is expose the underbelly. The one signs have been around since about 2019, and it just shows that in the last 10 years, there has been a debt binge. I would show the numbers, but we haven't actually seen a commensurate increase in productivity associated with some of the debt instruments, and even the most recent commodities boom, including oil and gas, is still yet to be fully felt, within the structure of the economy. In the context of the structural imbalances and some of the looming debt crisis or that the country faces, you've got two things to, or two policy responses. You either increase revenue or you have to go and borrow. And borrowing means more raising more monies externally or domestically. And this is where some of the challenges which Dennis has highlighted, potentially with the US Fed increasing rates, then means that the availability of external financing for Ghana would become increasingly more constrained going forward into the future. But I also do agree with Dennis, and he makes a fundamental point that if you look at the budgets and the way we run budgets over the years in Ghana, the biggest problem we've got actually is on the expenditure side of the equation, where a lot of the plans and a lot of the spending patterns are not consistent. But number two, they are also not linked to any sort of tangible outcome. So most times governments will come and say, we've done a road, or we've done a school, or we've done a hospital, but we cannot see the trickle down effect of that, within the real sector of the economy. And part of this goes back to the way the public financial management system actually runs in the country. And lastly, if we want to address in part the expenditure issue, then you need to strengthen your public, procurement systems, where we're talking more value for money, and then ultimately that ensures that the budgets that we pass are credible. So these are the summary points. I want to quickly then show you a couple of what led me to this sort of conclusions. I would skip this slide for the purposes of time, but I want to also then show that Ghana is not necessarily an exception in terms of a lot of the issues that we're discussing this afternoon. In fact, going back to the pandemic, and as you can see on the chart on your left-hand side, a number of the countries that have received some form of IMF assistance or debt relief from other multilateral countries are all sub-Saharan African, countries. And by some estimates, we've even lost perhaps about 10 years of progress on the continent. And this means that governments are increasingly being forced or being strained to come up with innovative policy solutions to address some of the challenges that we have with the economy on the continent. So in the Ghana context, I think to understand where we are, we actually need to go a little back, into history, just to get a bit of the context. So I will just show you a couple of charts here to tell a bit more of a visual story as to where we're coming from. First, starting with the growth numbers and the growth projections. So you can see before the advent of oil discovery on your left-hand side, if you took out the total growth of the economy and you worked out the compounded growth rate, Between 2001 and 2010, in the 10 years before oil, that's roughly about 7% compounded growth per year. But with the advent of oil discovery, the story is actually the other way around, where we had the big growth number in 2014, but the story really has been successive year-on-year decline, and the compounded growth rate is actually a negative 9.5%, culminating in what we saw in 2020. But there are some offshoots, and the offshoot is what you see in the progress the forecast that I've shown on the chart, where I think in 2022 and 23, we would be looking at around 5.5% to 6% real GDP growth year on year. There are two other quick points I want to highlight on this chart here, which gives perhaps myself and others a bit of cause for concern. So if you actually track the policy or rate and you track the inflation numbers in Ghana, but also track the treasury bill rate, you see that since about the second half of last year, these have been inching upwards, and that has a big impact on debt servicing, which I would come to in a moment. But much more fundamentally, or much more structurally, it goes back to how the economy is organized. And so if you took the three main areas of the economy, services, industry, and agriculture, and you did a simple projection and put some lines through, you can actually see that since 2013, the services industry has been growing quite strongly, but it's doing around 0.97% of GDP thereabout every year. On the other hand, industry and agriculture has been declining at a rate of about 0.8% of real GDP, and then for agriculture, it's around minus 0.18% of real GDP. And this structure of the economy hasn't changed much. In fact, if you go a little bit back into 2005, you begin to see that we're not doing enough. So the claim or the emphasis is that the economy is growing, you see the GDP numbers, but it's actually not translating into the real sector of the economy, and therefore sustaining a lot of the jobs that one would anticipate. So you hear a lot about people talking about jobless growth in the context of Ghana. So let me then go a little bit now into some of the specifics on revenue and expenditure. Dennis made this point earlier, but I also have it here in a visual form. So if you actually added up the actual debt revenue and expenditure numbers year on year over time, going back to 2000, what you actually see is that starting from about 2011 or 2010 with oil production, our expenditures have just been ballooning, right, year on year, and the revenues have actually never caught up with it. So that's the left on your left hand, the chart on your left hand side, and the bottom green bars just shows you the difference between the green and the red, and you can see, right, on a year-by-year basis, we are just, adding on, or we're not collecting enough revenue, and so the budget has to be financed from other sources, namely borrowing in this case. You also see pretty much a similar picture on your right-hand side, chart here. And here, what this tells you is, if I took all of the debt, if I took all of the revenue and the expenditure numbers, and this time around converted it into GDP and plotted it over time, and you go back to 2008, persistently every year, we actually have a gap that we need to finance. And this accounts or amounts to about 6% of GDP that needs to be financed. So if you think about having to finance this every year and adding on to it, then it wouldn't come as a shock with some of the debt to GDP numbers that we're talking about, and even now potentially an IMF program, looming. If we take it a little bit more and you actually look at the revenue side of the equation, you begin to see an interesting dynamic here. So around 70% of the revenues that we're collecting in Ghana, going back to 2012, is actually come in the form of tax, revenues, and very little is coming in from some of the non-tax revenues. And then, of course, with us becoming a lower middle income country, grants or donor funding for as a share of the total revenue mix has actually been coming down. If you look at it on the aggregate numbers and you work out, where the potential is to increase revenue, and some of the initiatives like the e-levy, basically we are doing between 12 and 13% tax to GDP, depends on where you pick your number from. I've even seen 14, but there is a potential for the country to actually do about 20% of that. If you were to quantify this, this would actually translate into around $5 billion a year of extra revenues that the government needs to collect, or 25 billion Ghana cedis a year. There is an IMF paper, an estimate that they did from 2019 that indicated that some of the revenue or extra mobilization initiatives will only be able to generate an additional 1.5 percent of GDP. So that leaves you another about 4 to 5% that needs to be plugged. And this is where you see the government in the 22 budget attempting to, for example, introduce the e-levy, which comes with its own set of challenges that I would highlight. But like I indicated earlier, Ghana has a revenue issue, but the bigger problem, in my view, is actually more of an expenditure issue. So when you then look at the expenses, and this gets much more interesting, you begin to actually see again a picture emerge. And the picture that really emerges is the fact that we are spending pretty much all of our revenues on three items. The first one being the employee compensation, so government, those on the government payroll. Second one being interest payment, and it would perhaps shock some people that for the first time in the history of the country, we actually spent more on interest payments in 21 than we did on employee compensation, going back to some of the borrowings and then the debt issues that I had highlighted earlier before. This tells the same story. But I want to show you or compare Ghana to Chile just to paint a little bit of a contrast as to how the political dynamics often is at the root cause of some of the problems that we're facing in the country. So here what you see is two charts, one showing you the growth of expenditure versus the growth of revenue. If you look at Chile's case here, the dark gray line is, you can actually see the expenditure growth being fairly consistent. And Chile is also a commodity exporting country. They also have a fairly diversified, services sector of the economy. But you can see that even in points where the revenue growth was dipping, the expenditure growth in the dark gray line didn't change that much. So in the financial crisis of 08-09, they had a dip in revenue, but they were still able to keep within the spending limits that they had set for themselves. In the case of Ghana, you actually see a different picture. So what you see on your right-hand side chart is the graph is all over the place. Whenever our expenditure or revenue goes down, expenditure goes down, and whenever expenditure goes up, revenue goes up. And this has been the story going all the way back to 20 years. It hasn't changed regardless of the political regime that you have in place, but for perhaps maybe a few points that you can pick. But if you look at the overall trend, we are not spending within our means, and not spending within our means you have to consistently go to the market to borrow. So there are two key factors that account for this, and I hope we can also discuss in the subsequent Q&A. One is due to the commodity price, exposure. But in Chile's case, they also are exposed to the same factor. So perhaps that is really not the key issue here. I think the key issue comes back to the election-related promises that often governments make, and then when they come into power, they're being forced to spend over and above beyond their means. Because most times these party manifestos become government policy, but the manifestos are not costed. And because they are not costed, and you don't really have any strong evidence-based driving that, you are often caught in a position where you have to go to the market to borrow to meet one's need, and that then leads to some of the debt issues that has been highlighted by Dennis, by which I also show on this chart. So two quick points here. On the left side, you see the total evolution of Ghana's debt going back to 20 years to 2000, and you see two interesting trends here, which I highlighted. So between 2000 to the onset of oil discovery, also because of the HIPIC debt relief initiative that we received, the addition to the total debt or the total public debt wasn't really that much. But with the onset of oil production and subsequently with Ghana becoming a lower middle income country, you can actually see the huge jump in total public debt from around 90 or so billion. Now we're talking well in excess of 300 billion Ghana cedis. And most of this in the last few years, if you actually break it down a little bit, you see it being a mixture of both domestic financing and then external financing, namely Eurobonds.